Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. Continuing our great sessions today in the first day of the CISO conference. Our session is going to focus on the future of identity and access management. My name is Adriana Gliga-Belavic. I'm a partner with the cybersecurity and privacy team at MNP, and I'll be moderating this session. And with me, I have a panel of experts who are going to answer questions and tell us about the future of identity and access management. So now I'll invite my panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with Ketan in the studio.
I'm Ketan. And I've been guiding access. Have worn many different hats. I've been part of various organizations, and as we look at the future of IAM as part of this panel conversation, I think IAM has sort of become that de facto standard now across organizations as you look at things from a digital transformation perspective. So obviously, we're really looking forward to an engaging conversation with my panelists and obviously you, Adriana, for leading us to an interesting conversation.
Bill?
Thanks, Adriana. My name is Bil Harmer. I'm currently the CISO and Chief Evangelist for SecureAuth. I've been in the security industry, I've been in the IT industry 30 years now, security for the last 20 plus, and started specializing in privacy around the end of the 2000s. The concept of identity in my world is coming out of the zero trust environment, and I found that there was a very large gap in that world that we were moving very rapidly into, and I'm looking to see what we come up with some ideas on how to fill those holes.
Kevin?
Hey, thanks, Kevin Bocek. I am Vice President of Threat Intelligence and Ecosystem at Venafi. We focus on machine identity management. So all of those identities for cloud services, for service mesh, for web services, this whole new world. And that's very much focused on things like zero trust security, knowing how do you trust Bill's cloud from my cloud. So really look forward to digging into that today.
And last but not least, Hugh.
Thanks, Adriana. I am the recently retired director of the information security program at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. So my experience with IAM is it has been a core part of our program over the last few years, and it has been evolving very quickly. And I'm very interested to see what we can come up with in terms of looking down the road a few more years.
Okay, so thank you all the panelists for joining us, and let's dive right into the subject. So I guess it's no news to anybody. Identity and dealing with identities has been a challenge for organizations and for us as citizens as well. And if we look at the last 12 to 18 months since the pandemic hit, we had even more discussions around this subject. So maybe I will start with a question for our panelists. From your experience, what are some of the challenges and changes in managing identity and access management that you have seen in the last period of time? So who would like to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I mean, I think it's big. The big news there is obviously digital transformation. Business, government has raced to be competitive, to provide service, which to me, I've seen this rise in both two things, in cloud services and the rise of the engineer, the developer, as making so many decisions, making a lot of identity decisions, whether that's for our customers or for machines. So those are those two big trends that have smashed together, which has meant a whole lot more cloud services, a lot more cloud native technologies, things that we didn't even considered just 2 years ago, especially using things like Kubernetes, using native identity services from cloud providers. So it's that smash that's coming together. And if you look to the future, engineers are going to make more and more decisions. I would say, especially around identity. And that's something that we're going to have to work with them and make sure they make the right decisions. So these are two trends I've seen.
So I guess just to add on to Kevin, right, and I think I agree with him that I think we've moved and accelerated to a world where, we were all in offices, sitting in our four walls, and I think those walls no longer exist with everybody working from home. So it has really accelerated businesses to adopt ways to ensure that, end users, employees, or it could be even customers who are now interacting with the businesses differently to really enable functionality to ensure that we can identify that the people who are accessing the services, whether it be cloud native services, whether it be VPNing into the platform, or even from a customer engagement perspective, like the world has really changed in the last 19 months, and I think it has really helped organizations really put more focus on how can we effectively manage our identities, how can we effectively ensure that folks coming in are really who they say they are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I spent the better part of 5 years talking to organizations about the security following you everywhere to provide a better security journey, and the pandemic pushed everybody into you have no choice in it anymore. The little clues that we get from people entering the building, from behaviors that happen a little bit more naturally around networks that we own and operate and manage, don't exist. It's just gone, right? So you have people, I always say every home network is a hostile environment. So if you have all these hostile environments where people are operating, how are you sure who they are? And then you take that entire concept all the way through to Facebook's grandiose idea of the metaverse, where they want to have this world of virtual living. We've talked about that for 30 years since the net was born, right? The netizens. But really, how do you identify them? Facebook can't even identify, they cannot even quantify the number of real users on their own platform, let alone the identities of them. So it's a huge shift. It will follow into government as well. Social insurance numbers, social security numbers, single factor identity that's compromised and useless in today's society. How do you start giving that kind of power back to a citizen with some sort of self-sovereign identity?
And I know we'll talk about this later too, Adriana. So while we've shifted so much to cloud services and new ways to deliver value to the business, there's this whole rise in machines. So cloud services, virtual services that we've driven up. And again, engineers are creating them. And so that's the machine identities too, that we now have to consider as part of our identity strategies. And they're very different machine identities. And we'll talk more, I know, about that. So that's also part of the mix that we have to take account for.
Yeah, so just to reiterate what you've already said, we have those machine identities that are popping up all over the place. Our new buildings on campuses are now coming with over 100 built-in systems that we now have to manage. Some of them can affect life and limb, so that's a concern. While we've been moving toward a more mature identity management program, our cloud services have also proliferated in ways that we could never have predicted. For example, at the Thompson University, we have well over 200 SaaS services running. At this time, none of those are incorporated into our network in any meaningful way. So we have a real problem there. And then, of course, we send everybody home, hopefully with a device that was under our control, but often not, because they have a device at home that they like to work on more. And so we have to deal with that emerging bring your own device environment, where we have to figure out how to identify and manage that device as being tied to the identity of an individual, or perhaps to a machine entity instead.
No, and you all made a very good point. So, we went outside of our enterprise. We had to work in different ways to reach our customers in different ways. There was an accelerated digital transformation happening in front of our eyes for organizations that never thought that they will have remote workforce. So with this accelerated digital transformation, do we have to look at identity in a different way? Because we don't have the firewalls, we don't have the controls that we used to have before. So what do we see in terms of modernizing the identity and access management and some of the innovation that is coming, new models that we need to look at?
Identity is, and this is where it gets into the privacy world, that identity will become the behavior of the person. These things know more about us than we know about ourselves because they have a perfect memory, right? They remember. The trails are there. We forget things as it happens. But that is the telemetry that comes off the devices that we carry and that we use together, whether it's a watch or one of the Oura rings or a phone or somebody's home machine. It's all of those things are becoming part of us and part of who we are as an identity. And it does beg the question: who controls that? Who should control it? And how do we manage it? Because the more telemetry we have, the better representation we have of a person. But where do you get to that tipping point where you no longer have any privacy? Because between the cookies, the tracking, the telemetry that is being collected, how do we protect that and make sure that we're only sharing what we want to when we want to, so that our true whole identity isn't compromised yet again, and we start repeating the failures of the past.
And I will add to that. So you brought a very good point, the privacy and who is gonna own this data and how we are gonna ensure privacy going forward. So maybe if you guys wanted to share a little bit about what about the standards? I mean, we see so many different things going on in the identity and access management space. We talk about digital IDs. So who should come up with the standards? Who would like to take
an interesting one, because when you talk about the internet, it spans geopolitical borders, right? The Great Firewall of China can stop some things. There's places where they can stop it. But on the whole, when you look at the larger perspective, I can get online, buy something in Germany, and it gets mailed to me through the mail, and there's no taxes. It's very porous. So this concept that we just went through as enterprise, where there are no firewalls, governments are going to realize there's no geopolitical borders anymore, right? And then how do those identities move around? I carry 4 passports. So which identity do I have, and which citizen am I, right? And how does that work together? All really, really important questions, and standards will be it. But I think we're going to start seeing standards at a global level.
I agree with you, Bill. I think I think if you look at every country, like if you look at especially more so Europe, right? Like in Europe, they've already adopted some standards around, so for example, in Denmark and them, they already, they've already adopted like EID, right? If you look at Europe, like a lot of these countries within Europe are sort of taking those next steps and say, how do I provide you that digital identity? But I think as we look at things from a global perspective, how do you ensure things around, like, now if Bill is interacting in Europe, then how do we establish who you are and then sort of how drive those things? So I think I agree that I think we have to look at things from a global perspective, and just looking in our backyard. Like I know in Canada, we have some interesting initiatives happening from a digital identity perspective, and that's great. But I think at the same time, I think there has to be a better collaboration at the government level. And when I say government, I'm looking at, our provincial level, also looking at the federal level, to really help establish those sort of framework around how do we drive these things effectively, right? And also part of that element is we also want to ensure that, people who don't have these digital devices, or people who cannot access these services, how do you ensure that you make this inclusive for them, right? Because there is a population of people that don't have these, right? And I'll just talk about my parents. They're not digitally savvy. They're not tech savvy. So how can they adhere to some of these new standards that are being rolled out? So I think there's a bigger conversation that needs to happen around what this digital identity means and how can we make it available and also make it all inclusive for everybody.
Yeah, so just carrying on from that point of trying to make those standards understood, they are emerging standards at this point. And one of the areas that is starting to emerge is actual certification in the fields of identity and access management. So I think that's an area where we're really going to have to see some maturity. Right now, it's really hard to find someone who carries any sort of certification in the field of information and access management. And it's also hard to send them out for training because those types of programs aren't very well established.
Let's changing gears a little bit. So we talked we talked about identity and people's identity and digital identity, but we also touched a little bit on machine identity. And as we make all these changes and transformations, how it's very important for us to also understand the machine identities and where we are accessing, where these machines are coming from. So maybe if we focus a little bit on understanding what's the difference between managing machine identities versus human identities, and how do we approach machine identity management?
Well, if you think about it, there are two actors out there on the internet in the world, are networks, and it's people and machines. And people, there are probably 8 billion of us, but there are hundreds of billions, trillions of machines of all type out in the world. And I would actually say that in comparison, we might be pretty boring. And that runs everything from, again, the cloud services through the AI engines, through to just devices that we've relied on every day inside of our businesses. We go pay now and we tap. And they're very different identities for machines. Machine identities tend to be things like TLS certificates, code signing certificates that allow us to know one machine can run another. When we get software that comes to our mobile device, how do we know it can run? It's not because it comes with a username and password, but it becomes with a very different type of identity. We've got API services that talk to each other. So first and foremost, they're very different. And they may live for much shorter periods of time. A Kubernetes cluster or just a node may last for 30 seconds, very, very short time, or even less. So we now have a whole different set of scope of lifetime as well. But still, again, all of these services, we need to authenticate them. We need to be able to audit them. We need to have forensics. And so this is very different world. It's a world of speed and scale, different than those of us that have worked on human identity, like customers or workforce. And it's one actually, we talked about professionals. It's one actually that only machines can keep up with. We might be able to keep up with our employees or customers, but this is a place only where software is fast enough to keep up. So these are all some of the different attributes that we see emerging around machine identity.
So maybe picking up on that.
That's funny because I actually disagree with it a little bit, in that to me the human identities and the machine identities should be the same, right? We have a life cycle, we have a permission, we have a reason, we have the things that we're supposed to do. We do them a lot slower. But I think if we move the people into the way we manage machine identities, we'll end up in a better place in the future. Treating them as a whole, as people maybe even become more machine if we head down that cybernetic world. But having that concept of an identity is the pieces that build, because a Kubernetes gets fired up and shut down, but could be fired up again. So it does have a history. It does have a life cycle. It does have pieces that are brought into it the same way a person who gets hired by a company maybe leaves and comes back again, or a customer that hasn't been seen for 3 years. So I think if you take what you're learning, because there's so much really good research being done on the machine side, If we apply that to the human side, we make the human side better as well.
Yeah, I kind of agree with
Yeah, I
you.
guess we've seen that though. I just have to say that we've seen that, and that's why businesses, continue to have things like outages around like TLS. So I think that's why we really now, I know sometimes we've considered machine identity and human identity together, but we continue to see these errors. I think we saw like Microsoft had an issue where apps wouldn't run just because of code signing identity. So I would take a different perspective that they are very different.
Gotcha.
I can't shake hands with the machine, with the Kubernetes cluster.
Someday you will.
So Ketan, you are going to pitch in there?
No, yes, I was just going to, so I guess what I was trying to say that, yes, I kind of agree with Bill to an extent that I think if we can take the ecosystem and sort of adopt to some of that on the real identity side, I think we can solve some problems. But I think it also boils back down to now, we have these millions and trillions of devices out there, but, ultimately it still has to be tied back to someone, right? You have this something that does a bunch of stuff, but then who's ultimately owning that? How are you driving that? So I think there's another aspect to that where, who's managing the identity of these machines at the end of the day, right? Is it an individual? Are we looking at AI type capabilities right now, right? So, and I think that also, can drive into a lot of interesting philosophical conversations around who really owns the identity of the machines and what's sort of the next, life cycle of that identity from a machine perspective, right? Because, because I could take a device in my home and if I give it to Bill now and Bill uses that device, so I am in essence transferring the ownership of that device to Bill. Does that need to be validated? Does that need to be verified, right? So I think there's these other elements around it that sort of come into play around how do you drive that ownership aspect of these multiple devices that exist out there? And I know I'm talking more from a physical device perspective, but it goes back to when we look at Kubernetes and all these things kicking up. Ultimately, when these machines get spawned up and these machines get spawned down, you still have to have some level of who can do what within the context of these services that are, spawn up, and then things that can be done within the context of an identity. So I think we're definitely moving towards this sort of a mesh world where we really need to properly, kind of look at things and say, how can we ensure that the machine world is working effectively with the human world to sort of keep things in sync and harmony, I guess.
So
I would just add, Adriana, that there are more than one type of machine as well. So we are talking about machines as if it's one type of environment, and there are very different, of course, environments. My machine, this belongs to me and in many ways represents my identity. What I do on here is a big part of who I am. But then we have all those machines that really sit deep down in the background and use protocols like BACnet that are just doing all these things, running fans, running heating systems, purifying water, running traffic systems. And those are machines that we really have to start incorporating into our programs, because that's where we run into the life and limb issues, right? If you can turn off an exhaust fan in a toxic lab environment, you have put someone's life at risk. If you can turn off the boiler in Toronto in the middle of winter in a building, you're going to cost that company a lot of money in broken pipes.
No, and a very good point, everybody. So obviously we have to deal with a lot of identities, both people and machines, and could be IT or OT or IoT related. So how much automation do you envision that we are going to have to put in place to deal with all this environment to be successful in the future?
I'm going to say, Kevin, probably you've got the best answer on that from the AI side.
Yeah.
You've got to automate this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously in the machine world, you can't keep up. I mean,
Right.
The few minutes we've been here, just probably in some data center here in Milan, there have been tens of thousands of Amazon EC2 instances or others. So physically, we can't keep up. And I would say certainly too in the human world, all of the different transactions and the different attributes that make up identity. This is where we have to apply software intelligence to help us. We're gonna, as the humans, yes, we will set policies, but ultimately then we're gonna have to rely on software, cloud services, AI actually to implement that and make that possible.
Yeah. So I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of fragmented identities, and I think as organizations also start adopting cloud services, SaaS services, and every service you sign up for now, you have an identity there, right? So now I have a proliferation of all these different identities with different SaaS providers. And I think it's getting to the point where me as an individual having upwards of 80, 90 plus accounts across all the digital aspects of things I do in my life today, from banking to whatever, like all these things that have to be managed, right? And I think we're kind of getting to the point where there's so much proliferation of these various identities, and that's also causing a little chaos, right? Which is leading to cyber attacks, breaches in organizations, impacts at personal level where your banking credentials may get compromised and stuff like that. So I think we're kind of seeing all these different events that are, partially to blame the aspect of this proliferation of identities and not able to effectively control them, right? So it kind of goes back to how can we effectively control them, but also can automation help some of these things? And I know, over the years, we've been talking a lot about decentralized identity, and, is that going to be the future? Maybe, maybe not. Like, I think this is still an era where many companies are looking at it. There are standards being established where I can bring my own identity, but what does that really mean? So I think we are definitely going to see some interesting things happening from a future of IAM in the next 5 to 6 years as we look at, all these aspects of identities to ensure that we can now effectively prove that, this account or this identity exists. Yes, it belongs to Bill or belongs to Kevin, through the different ways to sort of help drive that. And automation is going to play sort of a big factor in sort of driving those things.
Yep. Yeah. The when you think about what happened in the early days when just applications themselves proliferated, right? To Ketan's point, we came out with single sign-on, right? Not a security upgrade, but a risk reduction and a usability function that was brought in to make people's lives easier. And we're going to see that same thing. It happens as the identities proliferate and end up in different places, abandoned, stolen, abused, forgotten, all the different places, and they start to have to do cleanup. Part of that is probably going to come from legislation. We're going to start to see that drive the need to clean it up. You're going to start to see systems start to automate the management of it, the life cycle of it. And that idea of self-sovereign identity, where I own my identity, it's mine and I do bring it to work. Enterprise should be encouraging that. They should be the forefront of this, because the simplest thing is, GoDaddy gets hacked, a password database gets taken, they get to work on it for 6 months decrypting it. We don't find out for 9 months, because that's when they finally get to announce it, or they finally said, we've done our proper investigation, we're announcing it. And in the 3 months in between, they've been attacking me and my corporation with those passwords and the password reuse attacks, right? So we in the industry should be fighting to get that individual identity, that self-sovereign identity out there where people can control it, manage it, bring it, share the piece that they need to, and be able to stop some of the sprawl that is out there.
All very good points. And, Ketan mentioned you have all these passwords and accounts everywhere. And I talk to a lot of customers who are saying, well, this password has been compromised here. And when I ask them, well, have you used the same password everywhere? And that happens more often than we might think. And, as we go to these digital environments, we find that controls are starting to move closer and closer to the data. And to ensure security, we start to look at the zero trust security models. So what do you feel the identity's role will be in implementing those security models in the future?
To me, probably the biggest reason I made the switch in career from Zscaler, which was zero trust, to SecureAuth was every presentation I saw or did in the zero trust world was, hand me a SAML token and I will, and then add in your magic that happens there. The policies will be done, DLP will happen, sandboxing, all these things, all this automation, which we need, will happen once you tell me who it is. Now, that was predicated on trust. We're building, we saw enterprise build these massive zero trust environments built on the trust of the password keyed when it happened. Right. And to me, that was just mind-blowingly numb, right? Not dumb, just numb. We were kidding ourselves and saying, we have this brilliant thing that will happen. But what happens if it's the wrong person, right? If it's the wrong person that keys it, say I've got an HR role and my job is to download the entire employee list every day. It's going to look normal if I do it. But if we have no idea who keyed that password, we're actually creating these beautiful, fast, efficient ways to exfiltrate data, right? And that's what the threat actors saw, right? As soon as zero trust took off, what did they do? They focused even harder on endpoints, on users at home, and tag them in the commercial world, tag them in Facebook or Instagram or something out here which is outside the scope of security for their enterprise, get control of the endpoint and then infiltrate through that. And then wrap it all up in SSL, right? Once it's all encrypted, so many people to this day still don't decrypt SSL enough. So to me, identity is the key that does unlock zero trust. And until that point, until you have a good, solid handle on identity, you've got a fallacy for zero trust.
Yeah, zero trust actually is at its core. I mean, it is identity. Actually, John Kindervag from Forrester, when he was thinking about what was he going to call this new model, he had an idea. It could be either zero trust or he was going to call it something like inverted PKI. And the reason public infrastructure, the reason he said inverted is that it came down to this fundamental atomic nature that I know whether it's the person or the machine. Because if you're out in the cloud, whether you're flying as a person or you're flying as a big airplane, how do you know which one is good or bad, friend or foe? And that all comes down to identity. So yeah, zero trust is just another way to say identity is it. Identity is cybersecurity. You talked about firewalls. It is the perimeter. It's the perimeter. It's the atom. It establishes everything in this new world.
Yeah, so again, going back to the whole zero trust, right? It's never trust, always verify, right? And I think we've kind of lived in this world where we always trust that, hey, you've entered your password or you've provided this machine identity based on a PKI type model, and I'm going to trust that it's you. But I think with the perimeters collapsing, I think we cannot just trust anymore. We need to take that one step forward and verify throughout those various transaction points throughout that flow to say, well, is it really you? Can you verify that? And I think that's the model where we see moving forward. And I think as we move towards this new digital era, and I think COVID has really changed that for every organization out there, I think companies are focusing more around, we kind of want to verify everything you do. And then obviously part of that, identity is becoming a key element because, gone are the days of those traditional walls. And, with users working from home, I need to ensure that you are the person who is accessing that information. And I need to trust through every step because the malicious actors are really good at spoofing things, are really good at looking into things and really act as you and act on behalf of you. So you need to now take that one step forward and say, how can we ensure and provide that verification that, yes, this is indeed Ketan or Bill or Adriana who are accessing and doing things within the context of the application or the system.
Yeah, that's absolutely the future of continuous authentication, right? Yeah. That dynamic. It's not just fire and forget. We don't just do a solid MFA, multi-MFA, whatever that gets you in and then forget about it. We have to be watching at all times what is happening in that data stream to understand Has the identity shifted? Did something slightly change? Do we up level? And it cannot be just, big binary switches that turn stuff on and off. It's got to be dynamic and stepped. So that way, if something slightly strange happens, we're going to ask a question. We're going to reprobe. We're going to test. We're going to feel it out. And then we're going to start to make more and more decisions as that continues to happen, all the way up to cutting them right off, or, allowing them back in, or what have you. That's the only way that we get through this. And that's why to Kevin's point, it's got to be automated. It's got to be machine learning on the back end, watching this happening in real time.
That brings me to the next question: is who are the specialized resources or not specialized resources who are going to be managing identity in the future? Because it sounds like it's a very different world out there for managing identity of the future. So what's your view on that?
I have a view on that one, Adriana. I really think that we need to apply a formal resource to the management of the IAM program, much the way that we've done with information and cybersecurity over the last 20 years. That individual will have to carry a significant program burden, perhaps under the CISO, perhaps under enterprise systems, because I have to remember, it's not just risk from security incidents, it's also building that delightful user interface if we want to get people to do business with us. So I think getting that first individual, if you're a medium-sized company, bringing that individual perhaps into an existing information security program, and finding a way to allow that individual to become competent over time. Because a lot of the people who are doing the role now have been building on open source and have been coding and building from scratch systems that are now becoming archaic and difficult to manage, and they're getting ready for that next more intelligent identity and access management program.
Yeah, and I think if you look at IAM, IAM is a journey. It is not a project or a program, right? And I think often organizations, they will go in, stand up these projects, bring in a bunch of people, enable the program, and off they go. But then I think there's an upkeeping with it, right? You cannot set it and forget it. It's a journey, it's a program, is going to need constant care and feed. And as your organization changes, either it be your machine identities or your real human identities, it is still going to need that care and feed overall from a program perspective. And I think, as Hugh mentioned, I think you kind of need stakeholders, and often, when I kind of talk to organizations, it's almost about, do you have a proper steering committee in your organization? And obviously, when we look at mid-sized businesses, they may not necessarily have the manpower, but if you look at the big enterprises out there, usually do you have a steering committee to help drive these things at an organization level? Do you have the business stakeholders involved as part of it? Because often you need technology and business working together on these initiatives, because this is not a technology issue. This is a technology and a business issue. And the moment it becomes a business issue, because you now have people and the business processes tied back to how you manage these identities. So it's just critical that there's the right blend of people involved this from an overall vision perspective for the program, but also as you see the roadmap from a program perspective.
No, very good point.
I would just
Go
add,
ahead, Kevin.
I think that engineers, developers are increasingly making decisions. They're selecting the technologies, the cloud services, or the cloud native or open source software. So increasingly, they're going to be making decisions that will have a huge impact on identity programs. And in many ways, and what I see emerging in many large organizations inside the engineering teams, they're building both cybersecurity programs, they're building identity programs that are in many ways parallel. And what I would say is that those teams are creating business applications that are creating business value. And I believe that they're ultimately going to win. So as identity professionals, as security professionals, I think we have to change a lot. We may have in the past owned programs, we may have made decisions, But I think we're going to have to now be the experts, much like a Formula One engineer that helps a Formula One engineer driver go faster because they're safer. But the engineers, they're the future. And I think we're going to have to really change the way that we've thought about programs and people and making decisions.
It really comes down to the governance side of things, right? It's even the CISOs were once the technical doers. They're now the risk and governance overseers, if you will. And security needs to be in the engineering world. Identity needs to be understood and adopted. And any engineer working within a company has to understand what's the risk appetite for my company, what are the boundaries I operate within, and then how do I take that with my technical expertise and build or buy the right solution that gets my company to where the bottom line is and increasing it. So you're absolutely right. The engineers are being enabled and empowered to be nimbler, faster, make decisions. It's up to us to make sure that that governance is there and they fully understand the boundaries that they have to be operating within, depending on what industry they're in.
Okay, and maybe let me finish with one question for all of you. So how can identity and access management impact the success of an organization?
It can make or break it in the future. It really will become that, because as we've given everything out, as we've sent stuff into IaaS and PaaS and data is sitting in different places and it's all sort of spread around. The last thing that we have control of is the identities, right? Whether it's our customers, our employees, our machines, it is the lifeblood for which we will operate. And that's how what I see when I talk to customers. Because I can offer them different things in different places, the one thing that they do not want me to offer them because they don't care is an identity store, because they're keeping that, right? Give me the functions, give me the process, give me the cool whizzy bits, but you will pry my identity store from my cold dead hand, because to them, that is their lifeblood, right? You look at Ford, right? Is a car company? No, it's a identity company. It's a data information company that sells cars, and the most important thing they have is those customers and the information about them. So I think it's absolutely critical to the future, especially as digital companies become more and more digital.
I would agree with Bill. I mean, actually, identity is what establishes the value of a business. It's probably the last thing that a business actually would have someone else take ownership of. Actually, if you do, then you're not a business, because what's the identity of your customers, your workforce, or your machines? That establishes actually what is a business in this century. You can get cloud services, you can get AI, you can get data processing, you get contract manufacturing, but ultimately, what is the business? Our customers, our machines. If we don't have that, I think, so I would suggest that's our opportunity to bring that level of understanding to the executive leadership, so that they understand how important this is and what it defines business in this century.
Hugh?
I absolutely agree. The user experience can be so negatively impacted by poorly implemented identity programs or poorly implemented security programs. If you are trying to provision a secure network or service, and the person can't get to it because they misplaced their phone or something else, you've probably lost that individual in terms of any ongoing relationship. So absolutely core to any organization.
And Ketan, last word.
I think I agree with all the panelists. I think identity is sort of becoming that key element for any organization, whether it be machine or whether it be humans, right? I think it kind of starts with the core, right? Because if you're onboarded in any organization, it kind of starts with who you are, what you do, and really that is sort of core to your organization. Your customers are core to your organization. So that's something that you have to manage. That's something you have to maintain. And it's critical that you also keep it secure from the malicious actors who are really after all that golden data, right? So I think we've kind of heard this over and over again, but identity is becoming the new perimeter, and I think organizations really need to step up and kind of look at identity across the board. Traditionally, identity has always been, has always looked upon as element that, yeah, we need to do that, but I think identity now needs to be at the center of your cybersecurity programs. It cannot be an island on its own. It needs to be part of the overall cybersecurity program, and it needs to sit on top to ensure, because that is what's going to be your kind of element that can make you or break you as an organization.
And that's all the time we've got today. Great discussion, and hopefully, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thank you so much to the panelists. Great discussion, and we'll continue the discussion of identity in the next couple of years. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.